This episode is being sponsored in part by Real-Time CTMS, a leading provider of innovative software solutions for clinical trial research sites, site networks, sponsors, and CROs. To get a free demo, visit the company's website at realtime-ctms.com and complete one of their contact forms. Hello and welcome to the Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid commentary for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower. Our guest this week is Jane Myles, with an occasional guest appearance by her lovely dog. Jane is a self-proclaimed clinical trial operations nerd. She's had the opportunity to work on global drug development programs across many therapeutic areas, but calls Hemonc her TA home base. Jane switched from molecule focus to portfolio focus about 12 years ago, first focusing on patient recruitment, then patient voice and input, then patient-facing technology and its adoption. She's able to merge them all together in her current role as VP Innovation at Curebase, building DCT technology and services to drive access and inclusion to trials. In this episode, we discuss the tall order of standardizing definitions in decentralized clinical trials, the role of sites and technology adoption, Jane's role at Dtra, lessons learned from the beach, and so much more. Without further ado, Jane Myles. All right, our guest today is Jane Myles. Jane, thanks so much for coming on.
Really happy to be here. Excited to just have a great conversation.
You're on the West Coast, is that right?
Yes, I'm really lucky. I live about 10 miles south of San Francisco at a little beach town, which really has nothing but waves and a Starbucks, maybe some schools, but it's kind of paradise in my opinion.
I'll say that sounds just about all I need. Ocean and some coffee and good to go. Yeah, I'm jealous here in a landlocked state. I'm in the middle of the country, so I see your posts as well about spending some time out by the water. I appreciate those.
Okay, so in a move that may make me truly hated, I not only live at the beach, I have a cabin that's even closer to the beach. My house is south of the Golden Gate Bridge. My cabin is north. And it's not very obvious if you don't live in California, but those two, just that difference is really profound, north and south of the Golden Gate Bridge. So if you follow me on LinkedIn, you may see occasional lessons from the beach, and they are just meant to let people what happens out in nature and how it can influence us.
Yeah, no, I love that. Like I said, I've followed those posts and truly appreciate them. But I kind of want to jump right in. I see you've had a prolific, diverse career in clinical research. I kind of like you just walk us through, maybe tell us a little bit about what brought you to the clinical trial industry. I think that's always sort of an interesting conversation. So many people fall in accidental ways oftentimes. Tell us a little bit about your background in clinical trials up until today.
Sure. I'll apologize up front in case my dog is protecting me from the mailman. I did fall into it accidentally. So I studied life sciences as an undergraduate in Canada. And literally in fourth year, I was thinking, I'm not sure I want to be a doctor, but I don't know what I do want to do. I think it's something in this space. And by coincidence, some folks from Eli Lilly showed up to my fourth year pharmacology class, which happened to be my favorite class ever. And they were there from the sales side of the organization, but they talked about clinical research, which literally was invisible to me. So I got very curious right away, enrolled in a master's program in pharmacology and toxicology. And although all the nomenclature and the genetics of pharm and tox have changed since I studied it, I think the first principles of pharm and tox are embedded and encoded in the way I think about drug development. It's always about risk-benefit, efficacy, and safety. So those principles show up sometimes to the chagrin of my teammates when we're talking about whether or not the things we're thinking about are really going to help in the quest for science. Anyway, after I studied my pharm and tox degree, I ended up in, of all things, a petrochemical research lab doing analytical chemistry, which was really different because it was non-aqueous. And I learned a ton about analytical chemistry principles, and I realized really quickly, this is not what I want to do. So I ended up joining Eli Lilly by coincidence, working in analytical chemistry and quickly progressed into self-directed work team environment and then process reengineering methodology and total quality management principles, and ended up doing a whole lot of process reengineering around clinical operations and manufacturing. Now, that doesn't seem like it would fit in like clinical research, but those foundational principles have been incredibly helpful to me as I moved into a clinical research career. And I did that at Lilly first, working on global trials. And by chance, I think, again, a lucky coincidence, the very first trials I had accountability for managing were compassionate use end-stage oncology trials. And you might think that's a horrible way to begin, but it's the best way possible to have the patient voice embedded in your thinking from day one. And it made me really clear, literally from the first week, like, oh my gosh, like all these principles we have in place around ethics review are essential. And when you're trying to save your father's life, it feels like it's not helpful. So understanding that balance was really important to me and shaped the way I thought about clinical research from day one. Anyway, long story short, but I ended up working at Lilly for quite a while and then worked at a variety of other big pharmaceutical companies. Lilly, of course, was American-based. Then I worked for a European global company. Then I worked for a small niche CRO. Then I went to work for a biotech startup that was focused on prodrugs for ophthalmology and oncology, which was super cool, back to the pharmacology. And then by sheer luck, I ended up at Genentech, which is how I ended up here in Northern California. And it was life-changing in lots of ways, partly because when I got there, it got really clear we were in this for patients. And I was in every other place, but this was different because we had the photographs of patients who were receiving our medications on the walls of the buildings at the campus. We had patients come and talk to us on a regular basis about what they were experiencing, what their unmet medical needs were. It was just the personification from end to end of drug discovery at the benchtop all the way through to commercialization, which to me was sort of like the nirvana of clinical research. And very luckily, I got to work on some medications that have truly changed lives, but also the practice of medicine, which I think is really interesting. When I talk to clinicians who leave clinical practice and ask them, well, why did you switch into this domain? The most common answer I get is I had the impact to make a change to the number of patients I could treat when I was in practice. I now have the possibility of impacting a whole population. And I think that that is a message we could do better at sharing with students as they're thinking about their career paths and how they could apply their scientific and medical training. So that's enough off of my little, soapbox. But that's a narrative that is missing for students.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't disagree. I think if I can go back to your kind of transition through the industry there, I mean, what's interesting, I don't think you even got to where you are today quite yet, but we're seeing more tech companies and software companies sort of come to clinical research and start to really make a mark on the changes that are happening. And you've kind of worked across the two modalities, right? So being in drug development and moving into sort of the more tech space, if you will. I don't know if that's fair to generalize, the DCT movement, so to speak. But I guess what's that transition feel like? And do you think that there's still work to be done in sort of bridging those two realities?
Oh, heck yes. So even while I was at Genentech, I went through lots of changes. So I was talking about portfolio level work at the molecule level, which I loved. And then I made this transition more into, wait, what about patients and how could we do a better job of finding patients? So patient recruitment, what works, what doesn't. And then it evolved into how might we change the way we design our trials with patient input, which is another whole story. And then how might we change the way we deliver our designs so they're more patient centric, she said with air quotes. So I ended up being the owner across the late stage global development domain of Roche on a number of innovative, air quotes, patient facing technologies. And even in that role, I was playing this navigator and translator role between the tech providers and the molecule teams, and particularly the clinicians and statisticians. It's like, so what are you going to do to my data? Is this actually a good risk? How do you know that sites want to do this? All those great questions that persist. Eventually, I left Roche, and now I play kind of the same role in a tech first company of mostly digital natives who come at it from exactly the polar opposite domain of, and I don't mean to demean anyone. I mean, often because you haven't experienced the complexity of clinical research, it seems easy to automate everything and just use code. I'm like, humans don't work that way. And actually, medicine is much an art as it is science. So you're going to have to account for different preferences, different disease state journeys, and frankly, different willingness. Not everyone is willing to do all of the things that are possible. So maybe a phrase I'm sort of known for is just because you can doesn't mean you should. So yeah, I now work at I guess we're still a startup. We're almost 100 people. DCT tech and services company. So we build lots of code to enable what can be done in a decentralized manner. Often that's actually applied in hybridized trials, and I think that's actually the way of the future for most situations in the near term. And lots of times we end up providing support services either to brick and mortar or virtual sites. But it's really interesting to me because I've been thinking about this and doing this work now for, believe it or not, more than a decade. Hard to imagine. And there's still a tremendous amount of misinformation, mythology, and assumption. So again, I'm in the navigator translator role, but I kind of love it.
Yeah, and I think that's, maybe an understatement to say that there's a lot of misunderstanding and false assumptions. And, I'm guilty of that myself, even as someone who's been on the site side for some time now. And that's why I love having these conversations, because if you talk to 10 people and ask them about decentralized trials, you get 10 answers, right? They seem to all cover the spectrum of what that means. So just if you had to give a concise, definition, how would you sort of define DCT in as much as you can? Like, what does it mean to you?
Okay, I'm going to put in a plug for the Decentralized Trial Research Alliance, DTRA, because the glossary of terms, which will include the formal definition, is coming like in the next 2 weeks. So yay. But I'll tell you what I use to describe DCTs, and it's from the lens of having made mistakes. Remember how I told you I was accountable for all this patient-facing technology? Well, while all of that was possible, I did not fully appreciate the complexity I was adding into both the patient and site domain by pushing point solutions. And when I say point solutions, I mean, sure, we were using e-consent. Yes, we were using mobile nursing. Yes, we were using apps and engagement tools. None of them were on a unified platform. So for me, decentralized trials are using that centralized platform, whatever that backbone is, to choose the different services and technologies that fit the trial setting. That can include anything from patient recruitment, pre-screening, consent, screening procedures that might be virtual or in a brick and mortar site, and then the actual conduct of the trial, as I said, often in a hybridized way. So the patient may be entering data remotely and maybe seeing mobile nurses in home or elsewhere, and maybe going to a brick and mortar site, depending on the nature of the assessment. So the first thing I talk to patients and sites and clients about is this is not one size fits all. Like, we don't have MRIs that are at home, and we shouldn't yet. So oncology is my home base therapeutically, and I really want DCTs to penetrate oncology as a standard. And I also know that until we're confident that all the radiologic assessments can be done with the same rigor and control, we're going to need to put some measures in place, just like we do in brick and mortar setting, to ensure that we really are getting a clear picture on how the patient's disease is progressing and what the safety profile is. Remember those pharmacology principles?
Right.
So for me, it's all about how do you allow optionality with a combination of technology and services through a unified platform.
So do you think it's fair to say that, the future is a la carte, sort of, right? So at that point, you've got to some degree, the patient may have the ability to choose how they're seen or how some of these assessments are performed. And I guess that kind of makes me curious about do the lines start to blur between DCT vendors and sites at some point? And then to what degree do sites have a choice in the matter, whether they can offer some of these things versus DCT vendors? And, it's not clear to me which one's necessarily better or worse. It's just a matter of, do you feel that option exists, or is there space for that? Or do you think that, DCT vendors will sort of dominate that space as time goes on? Maybe for the best.
I think that's just like the wild, wild west right now, to be honest. So first, let's back up and clarify a couple things. And I think Joy, who was a guest recently, also stated this. The regulatory parameters on trial conduct and oversight and the responsibilities of physicians as PIs have not changed, okay? And that is also like lesson 2 when we're having these conversations, because there's still a lot of, I would say, a gap in understanding in the level of oversight that's expected from a PI and who can do what in a clinical trial. So I find I'm explaining that quite often. Now, in terms of sites getting to decide which technologies they use, I do see that as evolving and improving from the site perspective, which I think is not a bad thing at all. I think it's a new thing. I think from the sponsor perspective, the concern is really just adding risk to data quality, which, by the way, already happens if you're adding patient optionality in. And I'm a big fan of patient optionality to allow a better patient experience. I always want that to be assessed by the statisticians and clinical team to say, well, what risk tolerance do you have here? And just how much variability do you think, or have we proven, is okay? And you might do a validation study at phase 2, for example, to really test that out with a sub-study within your proof of concept study. But not everybody thinks about it that early. So some of this is a little bit of experiment, and some of it is a little bit of willingness to try. And then I think as we get more comfortable, we will stop putting higher barriers and higher standards in place for what is new than what we have already become accustomed to. To be honest with you, a lot of the things that we think are standard at a brick and mortar site are actually highly variable, but invisible to us, right? But we've decided and accepted that the way sites practice these assessments and execute the protocol is consistent because everyone's been through similar training. Again, that's an assumption. Because just like in the sponsored trial teams, there's a whole bunch of turnover across a study domain over the time that it's conducted. So I do think that sites are going to get a bigger voice. And I do think that we're going to have to learn how we accommodate different collection modalities. And that's going to take some practice. I'm pretty clear that the regulators are saying we want this to happen. They also say we want you to come early and ask what we want to explore. Like, what evidence, if any, do regulators need in order to accept the data as registrational quality? So that means planning a little bit early and maybe not adding it in when you're about to launch your phase 3 study.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And to go back to your, observation that, the word standard is not standard, right? I mean, things happen so differently. And I've even recognized as someone trying to build out, a small site network, it's very difficult to scale because there's so much sort of personalization that goes into even, working with investigators or working across different clinics and practices. Do you feel that it's like specifically difficult or even in some ways incompatible to sort of try to scale out these so many different yet consistent options? Does that make it particularly difficult because of the nature of what we're doing? Again, I love what you said, that it's as much art as it is science, and I truly do believe that. But again, I find that makes it difficult. We like to think we operate in this very consistent, uniform way, but we really don't. And I'm not so sure that we should, right? Because I think that's my view, is that we're here to serve, and that means how they want it. But again, does that conflict with the idea of being able to sort of roll out, standardize, and scale these things? Or again, do you see that as being at odds?
Not at odds. In fact, so now I'm being a little bit optimistic, but maybe if we build DCT solutions that are site and patient friendly, what is required becomes a lot more clear, right? So when I think back to those first protocols I was overseeing way back in the day, like 3-part NCR, we didn't have workflows. Gosh, that was just not a thing. What's interesting about the evolution of technology in trials is that when you get it right, it becomes very apparent who is expected to do what next. Now, how they do it may still be a little bit different, but knowing what data element needs to be collected and where it goes and in what format is getting really crystal clear. I think the challenge there is often, can you apply the same parameters across the domain of medical practice globally? So is the standard of care similar? Are the basic variables that you would want to collect from a safety and efficacy perspective similar? Usually, yes, but the lab values are radically different depending on which country you're in. So I think the workflows get simpler. I don't know that the practice of medicine is unified yet.
Sure. No, and again, that's perfectly fair. It's something I, again, consider. I want to preface all that by saying a very narrow view at the site level, but that's why I love having these conversations. I think it helps, really provide some grander perspective. We are guilty of, well, I say we, I'm not going to throw everyone else under the bus at the site level, but I tend to get very myopic at times, because again, a lot of it comes down to, what do we have to do now? Or what are we being told to do? I'm very encouraged because I do feel a lot more collaboration over the last even 6 months probably between the sort of, whatever you want to call it, the DCT community and sort of the site community. We talked a little bit about that before recording. Do you feel that as well? Do you think that's becoming a little more collaborative and collegial at this point?
For sure, I do. And I think that a lot of variables have gone into that. One is that whole pandemic scenario where we all realized, okay, time to raise all boats. And also some of what was imagined became real to people. Like, okay, it's not perfect. And we had to implement it retrospectively as a safe, like a rescue measure. But maybe this telemedicine thing has some wheels we should explore more. And I'm on a personal mission to abolish the term sightless trials. Like if I hear that, I redline. And it's a mistake that I feel the industry, and when I say the industry, I mean sponsors and tech providers, have been trying to overcome for about a decade. I think I know where it started, doesn't really matter, but it's a term that got popularized, and it's been a barrier that maybe never needed to be there. Because remember that whole regulatory thing? You still need a PI. You still need a physician who can treat patients under the jurisdiction of local law. So while I do see a change and an evolution of site networks, and I'm excited by that, it has to be done under the parameters of medical practice, GCP, ICH, blah, blah, blah. So ain't sightless trials. No, not a thing. Don't say it.
Yeah, well, and that's fair. I mean, I think there are probably some sites out there that still feel like there's a little conspiracy to, get rid of sites. I think that it's becoming more and more clear that's probably not the most successful way forward. Not even just from a regulatory standpoint, but just from a practical and success standpoint. I mean, I think they work better with sites rather than without. I know you touched on it a little bit. I do like to sit in on those DTRA clubhouses that happen every week, and I have to admit I'm a little jealous of how you guys can sort of all come together and work through these as, again, presumably some competing companies in the space, but everybody sort of working together to drive forward, create common definitions to, again, I'm sure that the work is much deeper than that, but again, from the outside looking in, I feel like that's an amazing, movement. Can you tell us a little bit about your work with DTRA?
Sure, absolutely. And I do want to also say that patients like doctors, so that's another reason that sites will persist.
Absolutely.
It's a good thing. In fact, if we get there, I'd like to talk about one of the missions I'm on around involving patients' own physicians in clinical research, but we'll park that for a minute. So DTRA is a cross ecosystem group, like you said, who are working collaboratively to try to solve some of the things that are hard about implementing DCTs. And there's a member organization now of more than 110 different players, and they encompass patient groups, regulators, sponsors, tech providers, sites. Who have I missed? CROs. So what I love about that is some of the other cross-industry organizations have been a little bit limited on who could have a voice. This is not the case. Does everyone have the same voice? No, but it's only because they don't have the same experience set. And that's been a big, interesting aha for me as I've been working on my own initiative team as a co-lead. So the initiative that I co-lead with Brian Switas and with the help of Eliza Sylvester is creating a playbook for DCTs. Well, honestly, we struggled just with the term playbook because everyone has sort of a different definition. I think of the NFL playbook on Tom Brady's arm, and somebody else thinks about the onboarding playbook. So we kind of evolved that into thinking a little bit about how would you organize information so people could find it. And there are 12 initiatives. Mine happens to be this playbook initiative, which is going to take the outputs of many of the other initiatives and try to put them together in a searchable online tool that will make it possible when you have a question to go find information to at least arm you with the right questions. We're not going to tell you have to do it one way. That's not the mission at all. But rather, if you're going to think about this, make sure you consider these things. And when I say that, I mean the collective across these 12 initiatives will create that set of questions, the framework my job is really just to try and find a way to make that information readily accessible and relevant when you have the question. So that's the work of the initiatives. And we do have this Clubhouse forum every week on Fridays from 12 to 1 Eastern Time. Clubhouse is a free for use platform available for Android and iOS users. It's audio only. And what I love about it is literally every time I go, I get to learn something I didn't know from somebody I didn't know. So the something and the someone are really valuable to me. And therefore, I always think it's an hour well spent. I usually have a question and often I get to ask it. And now I guess I'm getting the label pragmatic innovator, which I kind of love. It's like, yes, I want to do the stuff, but how and what makes sense?
Right. Yeah. And again, I think that's important. I mean, the conversations, I've been turned off at times because I think the conversations can be a little bit, esoteric, right? And not really super pragmatic. So I think that's an important aspect, especially at the site level where, again, it's like, great. Obviously, we want to help make it easier for patients to participate. But what do we do? How do we actually do this thing? Right. So I do love that. And even to, call back to your point, I mean, how one interesting and maybe some low hanging fruit is how patients could participate from their local doctor's offices or their doctor's office versus having to travel to a research site or still a lot of research happens in large academic centers or standalone sites. And that's obviously a problem in a lot of ways. So I know you had kind of hinted at that. So tell me your thoughts there.
Well, let's start with the facts. I think about 3% of eligible adults participate in clinical research. It's a little closer to 10 for oncology patients, which is still a gap for me. And most patients say that they would be willing to consider a clinical trial if it was within their geographic domain and if they knew about it. So 2 factors. Then physicians, and I mean treating physicians, not research physicians, say we don't have a lot of time, and that plays out in the number of referrals that get into trials. And we don't really know which trial is a good fit for our patient, and we really care. Like, it's not okay just to get a notification from EMR that there's a trial. I have to go do the work as a physician to say, is this really a good fit for my patient who is a human being who I care about? So with those 2 facts in mind, what I'm really interested in is trying to find a way to marry up that interest from both the patient and the doc and decrease the time that both of them need to spend without violating GCP and data standards. Okay, so it's not that easy.
Yeah, well, and that's, there's some emerging solutions and companies out there trying to address this. I feel this at a site level because, I want to go build a network of referring physicians in my area. I don't need to have 15 sites if I can find a way to work with the other physicians who are at least interested enough to refer a patient in. But I mean, people wouldn't believe how difficult that is. It doesn't sound that difficult, but there are concerns, time, obviously, like you mentioned, there's still a little bit of, maybe misplaced idea that you're going to lose your patient and never see him again if you refer them to a trial. I think these guys need some sort of incentive, but it's tricky. Like you said, I'd love to be able to do stuff at the treating physician's office, but then you start to unroll or open the can of worms, right? Well, then do they need to be on a 1572? Does GCP training need to happen? How do we bridge that gap? Because it is a problem. I mean, I don't have a good answer for you, but I think it's an interesting problem.
Well, we have some ideas. And when I say we, I mean not just me, but there are a few of us who are really interested in solving this because patients also would rather hear about a trial from their own doctor. And if possible, stick with their own doctor because they already have that trust relationship, which does not mean that they wouldn't like to have access to a world-renowned specialist. So the perfect Venn diagram for me is you get to have your consult and maybe even your initial visit with Dr. So-and-so at MD Anderson because you're close and it makes sense. But then you can stay at home with your treating oncologist and do all of the things that would normally happen in the practice of care with your treating oncologist and the trial specific elements with that MD Anderson specialist. So an example that I'm thinking through, and I don't know if it will happen, is, if you had oral meds in your chemo regimen and they were pretty well characterized from a safety profile perspective, maybe you could actually do the screening assessments, especially if there were biopsies or specific biomarker samples to be drawn, and the initial tumor assessment through radiology. Maybe you do all that at MD Anderson. But if we can assume, and it's a big assumption, that the radiology collection parameters are congruent across machines and sites, and radiologists tell me they should be, maybe we can do the follow-up assessments and the later cycle assessments with the treating oncologist until a treatment emergent event happens or there's a safety issue, but that PI still does the RECIST assessment on tumor burden. So it's not exactly an independent review facility. It's putting the review in a more framed and contained domain so that the PIs are looking at all the patients in their domain. Now, there's a whole lot of gobbledygook to work through in order for that to work, like who pays whom, who's on what contract. There is some GCP training required, mostly around documentation standards, I think. But if you have a trained virtual coordinator to assist the treating oncologist, you can overcome some of that, not all of it, and you do need to document the training.
Yeah. So, and this is, again, this is a particularly interesting concept to me, and I think it's not impossible. But my question, I guess, is: do you feel that there's a pathway for that with the current regulatory landscape, or do you think there will need to be some changes to make that more realistic? I guess, does that make sense? Because I'll tell you this: at the site level, we get beat up for everything, right? They want to see our MRI machine. They want to see our IOTA training for anyone that draws blood. They want to see every, oftentimes unnecessary training that we've had to do to be on the study. So on the one hand, my mind says, oh gosh, I can't imagine being able to do that and tie in, potentially an infinite number of referring sites or whatever you want to call them, while my heart says yeah, we can do that. But do we have to sort of navigate very carefully through the current standards, or do we have to say, look, we got to change this more fundamentally so that it can be more opened up to this?
That's a great question. So I don't actually think it's a regulatory code requirement. I think it's an interpretation of regs. So when I remember back to ICH, there's one line that says you have to document and verify that the site is qualified. That's it. But that turned into all of the elements that you just described. And some of them are really necessary. Like, yes, I have sent those hologic spines across the world to look at collection parameters in BMD machines, because that was the variable upon which our efficacy would be determined. But we don't need that for every trial. So some of it really comes down to that risk assessment that we were talking about earlier. Like, what is critically important for the science in this trial? And how do we ensure that everyone who's involved is really appropriately trained and knows what's expected of them? But maybe it's not a one size fits all again. So I like to think that the regulatory signals not a clear direction, but the regulatory signals are we are open to new ways to modernize trials. And oh, by the way, we now expect you to recruit and retain patients representative of the disease under study. Guess what? We're going to have to make some shifts in our behaviors and norms.
No, I'm with you 100%. I think it's interesting, and you again touched on it. I mean, go read ICH-GCP, even read FDA guidance. I mean, some of it is pretty thin. It's pretty vague,
Yeah.
and instead of thinking about how to better serve the patient, I think we've gone kind of too extreme the other direction. Instead of how much can we sort of, I don't know what it is, protect ourselves, I don't know. I mean, obviously we want to maintain patient safety, but we sort of built these things that maybe were never necessary in the first place. I mean, that's a very interesting way to consider it. Again, maybe some of them aren't.
That might be. And then there you got old guys like me who remember the pain of the one time one thing happened and now build it into every situation. So in my last role before I joined the startup, I was working with a multinational CRO, and what I was doing was really writing the process documents on how you implement DCTs. They were not platform specific. And that really required me to think carefully and talk to my stakeholders like, okay, you can't actually build this for the 2% solution. You have to build it for the 98% solution, and then think about what 2% you need to add in for your specific needs. But mostly, because we're really risk averse, we might build to the 90% solution as a standard in big pharma. And I wonder if we now have at least an 80-20 opportunity instead of a 90-10. But I'm going to tie us back to the DTRA for a second, because on Friday, the topic is about the new FDA guidance on digital health technology, DHTs. I didn't know what a DHT was till I read the guidance. But what's exciting to me about it is, A, the Clubhouse forum will have an expert who's read it, interpreted it, may not know every element about it, but I'm going to ask some questions, because when I read it, I thought that I read you can no longer disqualify a participant because they don't have access to the technology to collect the data you're looking for, which is a really big concern that comes up around the use of technology and if we're actually creating a new set of barriers and biases in who can participate.
Right.
Now, I may be misinterpreting. None of this is in force. It's just for review at this time, but I was excited when I read that, and that was the message I took from it. Now I need to confirm it with somebody who knows more about it than me.
Okay, so we're getting towards the end here, but something I like to ask every guest that comes on before I let them go is, what is something, a tool or trick, resource? What's something you use to, just make you a little bit better at what you do? I'm really interested in, whether it be a book or a podcast or a technique or whatever the case may be. It doesn't have to be research related, but maybe something that just kind of helps you be the best Jane you can be.
Oh, well, easy answer first, getting outside every day and really trying to reoxygenate my blood. So that commitment to moving my body actually frees my mind, and I get into what I call flow state, which is where the real fun happens. But then professionally, it's sort of funny. Maybe it goes back to that TQM beginning story. Using process flowcharts and swim lane diagrams sounds really nerdy, and it is, but oh my gosh, it clarifies the things I'm assuming. And I think it's actually one of those elements that is going to help us implement these technologies in ways that are useful, because without them, it's really easy to make assumptions about who's doing what and what happens next.
Yeah, that's I love that, because it's something I've oftentimes overlooked myself personally. It's just process in a very clear manner. And go back to your point before that. I'm with you. Get some get some grass under your feet and get outside. I think that can, just help keep you in balance and give you some perspective. Again, I really want to thank you for coming on. Where can people find you online?
Well, I'm in LinkedIn under Jane Myles, and there you might see the sand under my feet when I do my lessons from the beach. And if you're an IG follower, I'm Stash Gem, and that's actually all about yarn and my insane obsession with knitting.
I love that. I'll make sure that we drop your contact info on the website. Have some people reach out to Jane. She's a constant source of good information. Jane, thank you so much for coming on. Anything before we go?
Thank you very much for inviting me. Someday I'll tell you about the data that we now have that shows evidence of impact, but we'll hold that for another day.
Yeah, I'm thinking that I want to do a whole separate round focusing on that. So stay tuned. We'll have Jane back on. And again, thanks so much.
Really appreciate it and love listening to the people you invite. So thanks for letting me be part of that.
Thank you. As always, thanks so much for listening to the Note to File podcast. Make sure and check us out at notetofilepodcast.com for episode transcripts, show notes, and our guests' contact information. Thanks again.